Do you have an estimate how many more dollars you might need to reprogram, first? And second, how are you thinking about a supplemental appropriation for cost recovery for the Corps?
Ranking Member Larson, thank you for that question. Similar to the Coast Guard, we certainly want to get ahead of the administration, but right now we've been able to use the project funds, and as your opening statement indicated, that dredging work that we had planned to do with those funds in this year will still need to be done. The emergency reprogramming that I referenced in my opening statement, most of that money we didn't need. So where does that money come from? Mainly it's bid savings. A lot of these projects had happened during times of COVID when it was a very favorable bid environment, and we were able to go back to those funds. A good example of what some of that might be, a contractor might put a claim on a project, a request for equitable adjustment, and a few years later, those claims have been adjudicated, and if we didn't have to pay that request, then we would unobligate those funds.
Mr. Chairman, if I could indulge me for a moment, not for a question, but I do want to let Chair Hamady know. I'll need to absorb your first half of your report. It's rather technical. I'm not an engineer, but we'll absorb it and get back to you with some questions on it. And just as a data point for the committee, the Skagit River Bridge collapse in 2013 cost a total of $19 million. For the insurer, and took us 10 years to recover $19 million. So we should not be thinking of waiting to recover costs from insurance, the insurer of the carrier or the bridge or whatever, in order to pay for it. It's going to have to take place first, because it took 10 years to get $19 million. If that's the average time it gets $19 million, we'll all be dead by the time we get the money back from this ocean carrier. So. Just a data point for folks. Thanks.
Mr. Crawford. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. I want to start by acknowledging the 6 workers who lost their lives as a result of the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Obviously, our deepest sympathies go out to their families and their loved ones. Hours after the Francis Scott Key Bridge tragically collapsed, President Biden came out and said it was his, quote, intention that the federal government will pay for the entire cost of reconstructing that bridge. And further, he had, quote, directed his team to move heaven and earth to reopen the port and rebuild the bridge as soon as humanly possible. Administrator Abbott, I have a series of questions here as we try to understand the mechanics of the situation before us. And if you would, just give me a yes or no response in the interest of time. While the bridge was located on I-695 prior to its collapse, it wasn't actually considered a part of the interstate, but rather was Maryland State Route 695. Is that correct?
Yes.
The bridge had previously never received any federal funding. Is that correct?
Yes.
I understand that Federal Highways has since approved a request by Maryland to designate the bridge as interstate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Meaning the federal share for reconstruction under the Emergency Relief Program will now be 90%. Is that correct?
Yes, instead of 80.
Okay. So what we're talking about here is a delta of 10% for a bridge that previously never received any federal funding.
Yes.
Okay. In your testimony, you mentioned that authorizing a 100% federal cost share would be consistent with past catastrophic bridge collapses. How many times has Congress authorized a 100% federal share for a fully collapsed bridge?
I think the reference point we're using is the I-35W collapse in Minnesota.
Okay. Some say that we need 100% federal funding so we can get the rebuilding done quickly, but that's not how the ER program works. It's a reimbursement program, correct?
Absolutely.
As I understand the ER financing process, generally individual states, the division offices, and the program office have a process to make sure that projects are ready to receive funding and work can be completed in a specified time period. Is that right?
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter if a project is getting 80% federal share, 90%, or even 100%. The reimbursement is based on project progress and delivery, correct?
Yes.
I just want to be clear that nothing is going to move faster if this is 100% federal funded versus 90% or any other percentage. Whether the state contributes money or not, the process for awarding federal reimbursement is still the same, correct?
Can I just deviate from the yes, no for a second?
Go ahead.
Yes. However, the 10%, so this is the second largest ER request we've ever received, $2.2 billion for Katrina was the first one, so $1.7 to $1.9 billion. So that 10% delta is about $170 to $190 million for the state of Maryland that, as they're programming out their multi-year, multi-billion dollar program, it may not be this project, but it may have impacts on other projects.
Okay, let me just briefly, in the time that I have left, let's talk about the regulatory regime that will be applied here. Are we going to expect any kind of waivers or anything like that on NEPA or any other regulatory compliance measures that would be customary on any other construction project?
So, sir, we would not waive NEPA or any of the environmental requirements, but what we have done is coordinated with our agencies who issue permits, and it is our intention, because the bridge previously existed in this relative footprint, that it would be likely a categorical exclusion, which would minimize the time.
Expand on categorical exclusion. What does that mean?
When you go through NEPA, you can either do like a full environmental impact statement. We could get to a finding of no significant impact on environmental assessment. Categorical exclusion is sort of the more time-limited finding, and what is the reason we would use that basis here is because the bridge previously existed, and we're putting a bridge back relatively in the same footprint.
You're putting it back in the same spot, but not necessarily, because you're probably going to use different kind of construction. Would there be some associated flow studies, for example, to address the new construction?
So that is why we are coordinating with our sister agencies who issue the permit, because it is, as I said, relatively in that same footprint, but probably going to use different piers. It's probably going to have a little bit of tweaking to the approaches, a different height than was there before. So that's why I can't say definitively that'll be a categorical exclusion. It's what we're working towards.
So it sounds to me like there's going to be a great deal of flexibility in the interest of getting this thing restored, rebuilt, and restoring traffic and commerce and everything associated with that bridge. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if flexibility is the right word. I think attention from the sister agencies and understanding that there is a desire to move quickly.
And I'm all for that, and I hope that in the future that other projects are given the same consideration because time is money, and understand that that's certainly the case here, but there are a lot of other projects out there pending that have cost millions in regulatory compliance fees that have really been delayed as a result. So thank you, and I yield back.
Yes, sir.
Jordan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Batt, Department of Transportation data show that traffic crashes rose 29% on alternative routes in the weeks following the Key Bridge collapse. The same data show that it now takes between 2 and 4 times longer for drivers to travel those alternative routes. That traffic means trucks are delayed in reaching their destinations, commuters are late getting to their jobs or home to their families, and there is more air pollution and wasted fuel. How has the loss of the Key Bridge hurt traffic safety and reduced mobility for drivers in the Baltimore region?
Thank you for the question. I think, we saw in Philadelphia after I-95, we had that bridge collapse, that there was just all kinds of traffic moving through neighborhoods and trying to find their way. And I think a similar effect is happening in Baltimore. Usually when you have an impact where you remove a significant piece of infrastructure, traffic seems to level out after a while. That's not happening here in Baltimore to the same extent. And I think it's because of just the criticality of this artery. It's part of the Northeast Corridor. It's important for Maryland. It's important for Baltimore, but it's also important for the Northeast Corridor. And so, yes, there are trucks and vehicles moving through neighborhoods that they would not normally be on, and that's why it's so critically important that we move with as much speed as possible.
Administrator Batt, it is clear that we need to restore commerce to the Port of Baltimore and rebuild the bridge to improve safety and mobility in the region. The full Maryland delegation has proposed legislation to provide 100% federal share for the cost of the new bridge. I wholeheartedly support this legislation. What effect would the 100% federal share have on efforts to rebuild the bridge quickly?
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I've spent a lot of time running state DOTs in my career. I've been on the private side, so I was with AECOM before this job that works on bridges across the globe. And I would just say what the benefit of the 100% share brings is just it removes an element of uncertainty. So right now, I think Maryland, and I have to commend Maryland DOT, just really been consummate professionals throughout this process. Right now, what they're contemplating is an ER shortage that we have told them about, that we have $3.7 billion in unmet needs as the Federal Highway Administration, with about $870 million available for nationwide ER efforts. And so we're telling them we believe that we'll have the ER funding there for you. And then they have the uncertainty of the 90% versus the 100%. We did remove the 80% uncertainty. And so as you're planning out these multi-year, multi-billion-dollar construction programs, not knowing whether or not that $170 million is going to be there, does it impact things right now at this moment? No, they're going to move forward. But as they're projecting out and as they're trying to build their construction program, other contractors, it's an element of uncertainty that would be helpful. And just to clarify on the 100%, obviously any insurance payments, as the ranking member had mentioned, would be reapplied. So I can pretty much with certainty guarantee this will not be 100% federally funded eventually, because we will recoup all of the insurance payments as possible, and they will go back into the ER funds. But as the ranking member mentioned, we don't want to wait through all of the litigation and the NTSB investigations insurance issues for that.
Thank you. I yield back. Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting this together. It's very informative. Thank you, witnesses. Last week, the Army Corps notified congressional offices that they would be utilizing the Emergency Reprogramming Authority to the program to reprogram approximately $33 million of previously appropriated operation and maintenance, harbor maintenance trust fund dollars for recovery costs imposed by the collapse of the Key Bridge. Nearly $1 million was reappropriated from Florida and projects in Florida without any request for input from congressional delegation, the state, or the people. While the recovery effort in Baltimore is important, this reprogramming of the funds represents a blatant disregard for Florida and desperately needed improvements to our water resources and infrastructure. General Graham, if these recently reprogrammed funds were deemed to be in excess, why did the Corps let these funds sit for years and not act sooner to reprogram them towards projects locally in Florida? And will the Corps plan to reimburse the South Atlantic Division for these funds?
Congressman Webster, thank you for that question. The example I used earlier of some of the funds that we had set aside for when a contractor put a claim, that was from Jacksonville, and that was from the Jacksonville District, and it was Jacksonville Harbor. So in this case, those funds, I think $300-some thousand, are no longer needed for the Jacksonville Harbor project. So those funds in particular, that we had set them aside for a need and that need didn't materialize, we will not seek recoupment for those. We did do this work, this emergency reprogramming work, Congressman, very rapidly. Right? And we, as I stated in my opening statement, we haven't used this authority at this scale for 15 years. And we are a little clunky at it in terms of our notification to you and your staffs. And I'll use Jacksonville District as an example, if there are some of those funds that they do find a need for. We'll figure out a way to make sure that the projects continue. To your first comment on some of those old funds that have been sitting out there for a while, why haven't we cleaned up the books sooner? Sir, you're absolutely right. We should have.
As you know better than most, that the Gulf states fought against the National Contingency Plan Unified Command Structure response throughout the Deep Horizon oil spill. The National Incident Commander's report concluded the state's efforts resulted in the political and social nullification of the oil spill response doctrine and structure and governance. It appears that the press reports that meetings with Maryland state officials and a number of staff member trips to the wreck site, that Maryland embraced the National Incident Command structure and then has worked well within that structure. Is the National Incident Command structure still an effective and efficient mechanism for coordinating federal interagency and state, local, federal interactions during the incidents such as the Dolly?
Congressman, if that's for me, I can't agree more with your statement. As the Chief of Staff for Admiral Allen on the Deepwater Horizon spill, and now being someone who has been witness to the terrific work in the unified effort in this one, it's been very, very different in terms of cooperation and collaboration. Underpinning that is the absolute necessity and the benefit of the incident command system under the National Incident Management System framework. That has served this response incredibly well. It's the doctrine of the U.S. Any agency, entity, Army Corps, state can come together with a common lexicon, a common way of planning to come together and make this work. But I'd also like to highlight a real difference that has made a difference, and that is that elected leadership and the operational leadership has been connected in a very constructive way. From Governor Moore to Mayor Scott to members of Congress from the Maryland delegation, they have taken it upon themselves to get regular updates and a great interest in the progress in the response. They have handled for the Unified Command a lot of the public affairs and external communications in a very constructive way, and they've actually provided the trade space for the operational response to continue on without pressure, without being rushed. It's been very constructive.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, for holding this important hearing on the federal response to the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Maryland. Further extend my condolences to the families of the 6 individuals who lost their lives during the collapse. Thank our esteemed witnesses for appearing here today, especially Administrator Bott, who was with us in Memphis on Monday. Appreciate your coming to see the I-55 bridge and the urgent need to replace it across the Mississippi River in Memphis and West Memphis. That is, of course, as you well know, a national treasure to have transportation going across the country there at I-40. We had the I-40 bridge have a problem last year and shut down. I-55 bridge could have the same problem, because it's in the New Madrid earthquake fault zone, which is predicted to occur. It's been predicted for about 20 years, but it's going to occur, and it's more likely sooner than later. As y'all look at the damages to the Key Bridge, which were caused partially, I think, because it wasn't built to withstand that large of a boat, and it could have been maybe the piers could have been buttressed and made it more stable. Is that correct? Mr. Bott, can you answer?
Thank you, Representative Cohen. And yes, it was good to spend some time with you in Memphis looking at that bridge. I think one of the things we're waiting for, and it was great to see the preliminary report from the NTSB, but I think we're going to be working closely with the NTSB just to figure out exactly what types of protection might be needed for bridges, and what could have been possible, but I don't want to step into the NTSB realm.
I'm sorry. Please.
Thank you, sir. For the Key Bridge, we are obviously looking at, there were 2 dolphins on the east side, 2 on the west side. They're rather small, and the vessel just sort of bypassed the dolphins. What ended up striking the pier was the starboard side of the bow that hit the column. The pier protection around the column itself is timber, concrete, a little bit of steel, but it's very close into the pier itself. Other structures that we're looking at have pier protection that comes out farther so that a vessel can't get to the column. Other dolphins are much larger, so we are looking at other structures across the United States to see what might be good models. I think the key here is you have a bridge that was opened in 1977, and over time, it's not the bridge that's getting larger, it's not the waterway that's getting larger, it's the vessels that are getting larger, and not just width, but height. With containers. And so it's important that states and other bridge owners are looking at, from a risk assessment standpoint, what is now going through, what is the vessel traffic, and how is our infrastructure protected.
So were the bridges built after 1977 that were built in a fashion that they would have been able to withstand such an impact?
You have to, yeah.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. It's an important question. We are working with our state DOT partners to identify all of the bridges that are subject to, seagoing vessels, also, in the Great Lakes region, barge traffic on the Mississippi and other waterways. I think what this bridge incident has done is driven home that need to look at many of our bridges, which are older, and look at that protection, and we're going to rely on the NTSB recommendations. Again, there was a lot of force. I've heard different, analogies of the force, the equivalent of a rocket ship taking off. And so we just want to be careful in our consideration of how we both protect and build bridges in the 21st century as they're dealing with these new potential threats.
Thank you. I just would like to urge you, as I did in Memphis, that we need to look at preventative measures so we don't have another Francis Scott Key Bridge disaster. And earthquakes would cause that. And there's no place in the United States, I think, more vulnerable than the New Madrid Fault and the I-55 bridge that was built before there were seismic standards that were not part of the bridge. So it's deficient, needs to be replaced, and hope that you'll look in terms, just as this disaster, at the bridges that we fund under the bipartisan infrastructure bill be ones that might be susceptible to either God created, I hate to say God, I hate to give God responsibility, but disasters that are caused by other than man-made disasters. I yield back, and I thank you for coming, and Elvis thanks you too.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll begin by just offering my condolences to the family, and I think it underscores, the circumstance underscores how potentially horrific, almost unimaginable, what might be seen as mundane work can end up being at a critical moment. It is unimaginable. If you can imagine yourself at 2 or 3 in the morning falling, 100, 200 feet into the water, steel and concrete crashing around you. With that, Administrator Bott, the Francis Scott Key Bridge was a toll facility that never received any federal funding prior to the collapse, right?
Yes, sir.
And how much revenue did the state of Maryland receive or generate from the bridge on an annual basis, if you know?
Sir, I'd have to double check. I don't want to give you a false number.
Okay,
I'll come back to you on that.
I didn't know if you would have a different figure than I do. I've got about $56.8 million in 2023, just for your reference. So that's what they were taking. And under the current law and under this administration's plan, the bridge would get 100% share. So the federal government would pay 100% of that. And while you say that this is consistent with bridge collapse emergencies in the past, and I think you're referring to the I-35 collapse, that was not a toll bridge, right? That was part of the interstate system. And so my questions, I guess, center around payment for this. I think we can all agree that we probably and shouldn't wait for the insurance companies and the litigators to work it out, but Maryland had insurance on the bridge, didn't they?
Sir, I'm aware of one policy that Maryland has for $350 million.
$350 million, right?
Yes.
So that should, by all rights, you would assume, be actioned and go towards paying for a portion, whatever portion of the bridge reconstruction it would pay for, right? It would,
Absolutely, sir. I have yet to go through and have our lawyers figure out exactly what is in there. But yes, whatever portion of that $350 million we would apply.
So I guess when you say consistent with past emergencies, as you already said, the relief fund is 3.7 billion behind. We're 35 trillion this month in debt at the federal level. And I wonder if you think it's fair that the American taxpayer should not only pay to reconstruct the bridge, but then pay tolls after which to use the infrastructure they just paid for in their taxes. Is that because you're going to set a new precedent here, and is that the precedent we're going to set, or is there some plan to recoup the cost of reconstruction of the bridge? And I think according to the figures we've heard today, upwards of $2 billion, a bridge that originally cost $60.3 million. Is there some plan to recoup that and send that back into the disaster relief fund or to the highway fund, which continually needs massive infusions from the general fund just to stay afloat? What's the plan?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Very important questions, and I appreciate your interest. So let me just try to quickly go through that. Where this was a Maryland state facility before, now it's been designated as part of the interstate system. They were free before to collect their tolls and use them, for, maybe Port of Baltimore, whatever they were using them for. Now, since this has been federalized as a facility and going forward when the tolls are restored, as part of the interstate system, they will have to use those for Title 23 eligible funding. So whether it's the maintenance of the existing bridge or other Title 23 highway purposes in Maryland. So the American taxpayer will be benefiting from those tolls. In terms of the precedent, if it was a pre-existing toll facility, they are allowed to toll the facility going forward. But again, it would be using Title 23 eligible expenditures on those tolls.
I understand the Title 23 expenditures and understand that they'd be used for surface transportation in Maryland, but you're asking the taxpayers from across the country to pay for it. And if you're from Washington State, likely you're never going to travel across that bridge, but you're sure going to pay for it. And as long as we're setting precedent, I think it would be appropriate at least to consider reimbursing through the tolls the emergency fund or the transportation fund for the entire country before all of the money goes right back to the state that's going to be receiving it where the bridge resides, which arguably I think can be said was not prepared to withstand the traffic impact that it had. Meanwhile, it's right there. I mean, it's not like it was a surprise that the bridge is there and ships are going under it and this could happen. So with that in mind, with the time that I've already expended and expired, I hope you would consider a plan to reimburse the taxpayer under horrific debt right now, who can't afford their groceries, their gas bills, their daycare bills for the cost of this bridge, for which one state has been receiving all the money for its entire existence and apparently is going to receive all the money from the tolls for the rest of its existence. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the hearing. Witnesses, Vice Admiral and General, you and your teams and the support organizations that you've contracted with are doing extraordinary work, and we thank you for that. The issue before this committee was pretty much laid out by the chairman in his opening remarks. And I would suggest that we have an opportunity to clarify the responsibilities, some of which we heard from the previous member just a moment ago. A couple of things here. First of all, the notion, President Biden is correct. Okay, we'll put up the full cost of reconstruction. However, that legislation should be written in such a way that that the federal government will be reimbursed for any money received in the liability issues. The $350 million that the state of Maryland had as an insurance policy on the bridge, as well as whatever other payment may come from lawsuits against the shipping company and the owners of the ship. So if we should, and this should be really the work of this committee, is to carefully structure the legislation so that the federal government, ponying up the 100% at the outset, would be fully reimbursed by any revenues. My colleague raised an interesting point about tolls. We should consider that and how that fits into it, and keep in mind the entire interstate system where tolls are collected in various places across the United States. So those are things that are out there. There's also one other issue that I want to encourage this committee to deal with, in addition to recovering whatever money might be available from lawsuits. And that is the Limit of Liability Act of 1851. It seems as though perhaps even that precedes the law in Arizona, which dealt with a different issue. That Limit of Liability Act really has to change. And I would urge the committee to take up this issue. I intend to present to the committee at the appropriate time a piece of legislation to do so, so that the owners of these vessels would be held responsible for the cost of their mistakes. And that right now, that limited liability would hold that the owner of the ship would be limited to $40-some million, even though the ship is worth $90 million or more, and the damage is somewhere around $2 billion, not including the cost of the recovery issues and the expenses that the Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers are now incurring. So my point here is to raise this policy issue and really the work of this committee as we go forward. I think the chairman correctly pointed out that we don't need to do much for the next couple of months, but this year we have to pass legislation to clarify the ability of the federal government to receive any funds that are available from various lawsuits that are out there. And also, this committee should, since it is our jurisdictional area, deal with this 1851 law that limits the liability of the ship owner to any accident and problem that they may cause. Now, I don't know if this is an appropriate question for the General and the Vice Admiral, but you're welcome to jump in if you'd like. But I think, Mr. Batt, and if you might comment on this issue about how we might structure legislation to recover whatever damages may be in the future from either insurance or lawsuits. You can look for help, but you won't.
No, I just, you referenced them, and I just,
no,
I'm taking a lot of the
it's
answers.
all yours.
So happy to share the time. So under the ER program, under the existing law as it states, any insurance monies that are recouped for any ER event across the country do go directly back into the ER fund. So the ranking member mentioned the $19 million Skagit River Bridge, and I think it was actually about $16.6 million that was recovered through insurance, went directly back in, but as he said correctly, 10 years after the incident. So whether it's the $350 million insurance policy that Maryland has existing, or post-investigation and post legal activity going on for as long as that may be, we will recover all of that money and send it back in. But as you correctly point out, there is some questions about how much liability for the ship owner that is out there.
That is a question really should be addressed to the Coast Guard, who might want to comment on it, but I'm out of time now, so I will yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Babin, you're recognized.
Sir, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here and your testimonies. I think there's definitely some resentment among my colleagues and the American public about this incident. The perception here is really frustrating, and you've already addressed some of these, but I'd like to ask my questions. If you zoom out, the Singapore flag vessel crashes into and completely destroys a historic bridge, kills 6 construction workers, and is now trying to avoid liability for the incident. People have a lot of questions. Is it safe for foreign flag vessels to operate in U.S. waterways? Are other bridges safe? I've heard a number of questions wondering whether their bridges are safe. Was this incident a result of foul play or negligence? What can we do to prevent this from ever happening again, and who is going to pay for this thing? And I appreciate you all for coming and answering questions. My first question is for Admiral Gautier. If anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to jump in. I know this whole response is a great team effort, but first off, I'm told the Coast Guard is doing a great job leading the way in the unified response in Baltimore. So I want to thank you and the Coast Guard for your commitment and all of the hard work that you and the Coast Guard have done. As you all know better than most, the Gulf states fought against the National Contingency Plan Unified Command Structure response throughout the Deepwater Horizon oil spill a few years ago in the Gulf of Mexico. The National Incident Commander's report concluded that the Gulf states' effort resulted in the political and social nullification of the oil spill response doctrine and structure governance. It appears from press reports, meetings with Maryland state officials, and member and staff trips to the wreck site that Maryland embraced the National Incident Command structure and that the response has worked well within that structure. Is the National Incident Command structure still an effective and efficient mechanism for coordinating federal interagency and state, local, federal interactions during incidents such as the Dolly collision?
Congressman, thank you very much, first off, for the compliments to the Coast Guard. And I just have to also acknowledge the leadership of Colonel Pinchason, Army Corps of Engineers, Colonel Butler, Jim Harkins, and Jeff Donahoe, who are the state incident commanders. It's a fantastic leadership team. To answer your question, the incident command system is absolutely a fundamental principle by which this incident response has been successful. It's part of U.S. doctrine under the National Incident Management System. It's how we respond to hurricanes, oil spills, other types of incidents just like this. I think we now have a great deal of practice in the United States since the Deepwater Horizon in doing this. And I think what I will just observe is that this particular incident had a very tight connection between the operational commanders who were running the incident and elected leaders who all shared the same objectives. The elected leaders took the time and effort, governor, mayor, members of Congress, to keep up to date on what was going on and to provide the trade space to allow these folks to get on with the response.
Okay, thank you. Second question I'd like to address to Administrator Bott. I'd like to talk about the path forward from here for the Key Bridge. What is the plan to replace the bridge? My constituents are not wanting to pay for this thing. In my view, the company or the country responsible for the incident should be footing the bill, not the U.S. taxpayer. If the U.S. is ultimately going to pay for this bridge, it better come out of funds that we've already allocated. President Biden and Speaker Pelosi authorized trillions for infrastructure, and that should be including bridges. The last thing I want to do is to vote to spend another $1 or $2 billion on a new bridge. So, Administrator Bott, talk to me on what you see as a path forward here on the payment for this thing.
Thank you, Congressman. And just in terms of the rebuild path, Maryland DOT plans to issue their RFP close to Memorial Day. They'll select a preferred team in August, and then they're looking at construction completion in 2028 is a preliminary schedule. And in terms of the payment, as I've stated, right now there's a preliminary estimate, $1.7 to $1.9 billion. There's a $350 million insurance payment that we're working through to see what level of that would be applicable. And any funds that are recovered through legal activity or insurance payouts will go back into the ER funds. We just don't have a path to getting there right now in terms of what is eligible.
Okay, I'm out of time, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing, and thank you for the work that you've been doing to ameliorate the harm that has been caused by this bridge collapse. And I also want to offer my condolences to the families of the 6 construction workers who were killed in this bridge collapse. And I'd like to commend the quick work of the police officers who made sure that traffic was stopped and no other people were on the bridge who could have been killed as a result of this collapse. And I also want to recognize the collaboration between state and federal officials and agencies to address this situation. And I want to get at this issue of perhaps there being some people in the country who are not inside the state of Maryland who resent having to pay for this bridge reconstruction. Administrator Bott, can you tell us how this bridge collapse impacts interstate commerce?
Thank you for your condolences and for the question, Congressman. I think, I've been a Secretary of Transportation in Delaware, in Colorado, and I was a deputy in Kentucky. And I think that, what is so critically important for our transportation system is that you can drive from New York to Los Angeles across a system that is completely uniform, is set to standards. And what is happening, I think we've learned through the Port of Baltimore, is that that highway system is tied into ports. It's the 3rd busiest port in the country, so there are jobs that are being impacted, there's freight movements that are being impacted, there are neighborhoods that are being impacted. And so, this is not just an issue for Maryland, it's an issue for the Northeast Corridor and for our national economy.
It's actually having an impact on prices for consumer goods. Is that correct?
That is something that, under the leadership of Secretary Buttigieg, we've been closely looking at, many of the goods that move through there. So there's a lot of coal that moves through that port. There's a lot of automobiles and farm equipment. And so to the extent, now there's a lot of that traffic has been diverted, and I don't want to get outside of the federal highway lane to other ports, but there is a lot of movements of goods from, say, ships that have diverted back to Maryland, and that is adding costs for those, say, vehicles to be finished at the plants nearby. So obviously supply chain is important.
Okay, thank you. When is it projected, assuming that funding is in place, that the bridge can be rebuilt and reopened?
Thank you, sir. The projected schedule right now is for a progressive design build team to be selected this summer and for construction to begin next year and run through 2028.
Thank you. And so it would be 2029 before the bridge would reopen for traffic?
2028, 2029, it'll be a progressive design build, so we'll figure out the schedule as we go.
Thank you. Chairwoman Harmondy, you, with respect to the causation of this cargo vessel losing power and that causing this vessel to drift into the bridge, are there any concerns, or does the fact that there seems to be no redundancy in terms of the basic power of the vessel, there's no redundancy. You cut it on, you cut it, it gets cut off. There's no secondary situation that would kick in. Am I correct on that? And if I am correct, what are the implications as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly redundancy in the electrical system and the circuit breakers. They switched circuit breakers after the power outages in port. With respect to the emergency generator, it would not allow for regaining propulsion. It really focuses on the critical portions of the vessel, which would be radio, communication, lighting. If you had any sort of, if you wanted to regain propulsion through any sort of emergency generator, it would literally take a 6-story generator on a vessel to do that. There is redundancy in, say, cruise ships, but vessels, the Dolly is not unlike other vessels. I think here is really determining for us what happened with the electrical system on the accident voyage. What happened in those 2 blackouts, and which is why we have been working very closely with Hyundai, who manufactures the equipment to try to replicate some of the electrical problems that were seen that day, and continue looking and testing each of the components.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to join others in wishing condolences to the families of those who were lost in the bridge collapse, and also I just find it remarkable the incredible action of the law enforcement community that came in and stopped traffic that could have been much worse than it was. Last week I had the opportunity to go out to the bridge, and Admiral, I'll tell you that Admiral was it Gilreath, right? Right, Admiral Gilreath and Captain O'Donnell and even Lieutenant Carter, who was behind you a little while ago, just absolutely remarkable. General Colonel, your district commander down there, Colonel Pinchason, I believe. Yeah, she was awesome. I had met her down in New Orleans, and she and her team did a great job. They're folks from DHS that were really, really good, and I just an incredibly thorough briefing and gave lots of comfort that things were under control, and I appreciate all the efforts that are underway down there. Administrator, I want to ask a question. I want to make sure I understand something. You said earlier that what's being done in this bridge is consistent with what's been done in other bridges in the past. Is that for disasters? Is that accurate?
Thank you, Representative. I'm trying to think of what I said.
I wrote down that you said consistent with historic bridge disasters, but there's not another bridge where where FHWA came in and just designated that it's going to be part of the interstate system.
No, we only learned that it was not part of the interstate system in light of this event.
Okay, so that is an anomaly. I just
Absolutely.
Okay, I want to be clear on that. And then secondly, so you've talked about the use of categorical exclusions and doing some type of expedited NEPA, whether you do a CAT-X or you do alternative arrangements. I want to be clear, fully supportive of it. But in the past, Minneapolis Bridge, the I-35 Bridge, I believe the bridge in Washington State, and others, similar things have been done. Can you cite where there's been environmental damages or destruction from that approach as opposed to going through the regular NEPA?
So just trying to think through your question, citing environmental damage by using the expedited approach. No, I can't cite environmental damage that way.
And I can't either. And actually, Major General Graham, sorry about that, demoted you. General, you recall after Hurricane Katrina, the levees were built using alternative arrangements. Do you remember any type of environmental damages or destruction that was caused from doing the alternative arrangements? Yeah, I don't think so either. I think it actually worked out really well. And so my message to you on this is that right now, the average road project takes somewhere around 7 years and 3 or 4 months. As you know, the White House has just released new rules on NEPA in line with the attempting to be in line with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, but failing on some things, but that would significantly shorten it. But my message is that this shouldn't be the exception.
The environmental damages haven't resulted from using categorical exclusions or alternative arrangements. Look, I don't know what the traffic impacts are of this bridge. We have a bridge at home that is the source of the 4th worst traffic problem in America. The Mississippi River Bridge, I-10 going from California to Florida. 4th worst traffic in America. We have taken 7 years to narrow a new bridge alignment down to 32 alignments. Like, you can't make this stuff up. This is outrageous. We have urgency there as well. Look, I want to be crystal clear. I fully support federal funding up front. Let's get this thing built. Let's get it done as quickly as possible. I fully support categorical exclusion or alternative arrangements. I've been in touch with the governor of Maryland, and I appreciate him reaching out. But this is a major anomaly. We've got a toll. We've got a responsible party. This isn't a natural disaster. And I think that we need to make sure that we're holding the responsible party accountable. We had a similar incident in Louisiana in the mid-'90s, the Brightfield incident came and crashed into the Riverwalk in Louisiana. It was a Japanese-built vessel. It was run by Chinese. It was I think, run by Chinese and flagged in Liberia. Admiral, I want to ask you real quick. Can you think of any similar incidents with Jones Act vessels that have occurred like this?
Not from deep draft vessels. Certainly, there are a number of towing vessels.
Sure, some barges and much more minor incidents. Chairman Hominy, are you aware of anything? And so, look, one thing I want to point out here, and for the record, she's shaking her head no. One thing I want to point out here, look, Jones Act vessels, U.S. built, U.S. crewed, U.S. flagged. We go through annual inspections. A night and day difference. And I think that's something else we need to take into consideration here. Lastly, Administrator, this bridge, it is not going to be built back exactly like it was. Well, it's going to be wider. You're going to have shoulders. You're going to have a different pier configuration. You're going to have different tidal influences. You're going to have bumpers. You're going to have dolphins and other things protecting the pier structures. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure that we're noting that this is actually a different bridge that's being reconstructed with effectively waiving or providing alternative arrangements or categorical exclusions under NEPA. Yield back.
Ms. Titus.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And like everyone here, I too offer sympathy to the families of those who were lost. These people represent sometimes the invisible folks who are on the front lines, who provide safety and security in our infrastructure, and also the harbor workers and police officers who were there and made the situation much less terrible than it already was. I would ask the chairwoman and Administrator Bott about one of the things that's been pointed out in the study of the bridge. It seems like it didn't have a reliable fender system, I believe it's called, to protect the piers from the crash. I wonder if you have reviewed bridges in other major ports to determine whether or not they have those fenders in place. And if not, is there an existing program with funding that might be used to retrofit some of those other bridges to be sure they don't have the same problem? We can be, I hate the word, but proactive about that.
Thank you for the question. We've actually been we recommended back in 1988 that the Coast Guard and the Federal Highways evaluate the adequacy of pier protection on bridges over navigable waterways in U.S. ports and harbors. That recommendation remains closed unacceptable because at the time the Coast Guard said they did not have the authority to take action on that evaluation. But if one thing I will say, and I hope that we walk away from this in considering, is the federal government states, bridge owners, they need to evaluate current structures and make sure if you have navigable waterway that you are doing a risk analysis to ensure safety, to ensure there's adequate pier protection. In this situation, we are looking at pier protection. We're looking at certainly the dolphins, but then the protection around the piers themselves. And then looking at different bridges across the United States. To see how those have been improved over time. In this situation, you have a bridge that began operations in 1977, and if it was built today, it would be built differently. And so that has to be taken into consideration. I will say I'm very encouraged by what the Admiral announced, their Board of Inquiry, about looking at ports across the United States to make sure there is adequate protection, and I assume that it will include some of the structures as well, including bridges. So that's great.
Okay. Administrator Bott, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yes, we're obviously working closely with the NTSB and just really respect their thoughts and guidance. We have already reached out to our state DOT partners who are the owners of these bridges. Similar to when there's any kind of bridge tragedy after Minnesota, everybody is reaching out to figure out what fracture critical bridges they had. And so we're going to go out. We've already got a preliminary list. We're going to continue to identify. And again, it's the deep draft vessels, it's the barges, it's examining all the threats and then doing that cost-benefit analysis of what protections are sort of quickly deployable, how do we get these bridges protected, and then how do we update design standards given the ever-changing nature of the vessels going underneath them.
Well, can you use, I believe the acronym is BFP, Bridge Replacement, Rehabilitation, Preservation, Protection, and Construction Program. Is that available with any kind of funding or that can be used to retrofit some of these bridges if they don't meet these requirements you're talking about?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, so in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there was $12.5 billion allocated for discretionary grant funding and about, I think, $30 billion on the formula side. Seismic protection, as has been retrofitting, is possible. And this is something that we're going to look into as we work with our state partners who are applying for those funds.
Well, as you look into it, if you find any problems with the program that won't allow it to work towards retrofitting in a situation like this or make it more difficult, will you let us know so if we need to make some changes, we can address those legislatively?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rouser, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to extend my condolences to the family and all those who were injured in this very tragic happening. General Graham, I'll start with you. Last week, the Corps announced it would reprogram appropriated dollars specific to other Corps projects towards the efforts at Baltimore Harbor. It's our understanding these funds were appropriated in fiscal year 2020 or earlier and have been determined to be more than what's needed for those authorized projects. Is that an accurate portrayal? Is that correct?
That's accurate.
So this has created a bit of confusion among members and even the committee here. Back home, for example, we've got the Wilmington District has seen several projects whose funds have been repurposed, notably Wilmington Harbor, Morehead City Harbor, and New River Inlet, all had hundreds of thousands of dollars redirected from their maintenance accounts. Can you provide the committee with the amount of reprogrammed dollars, a list of the projects you are reprogramming those funds from, and which districts those projects are in?
Absolutely.
Because we would greatly appreciate those answers as quickly as possible. And then the question everybody's got on their mind is how much money is sitting out there that is in an account that was appropriated in 2020 or earlier that has been left unused? I'd like to know the answer to that question too. And then following up, does the Corps plan to use Section 101A8 authority again in the future? And if so, are there any limitations to the number of times the Corps can utilize that authority within a specific time frame?
Rouser, probably we will have to use the emergency reprogramming authority again. As I stated in my opening statement, we have not used that authority at this scale for 15 years. And we understand that Congress puts specific amounts of money on specific projects and you intend it to be used for those projects. In these instances, as stated earlier, most of these funds were the result of bid savings. They were the result of we held on to additional money to settle claims with contractors. And so it's a relatively a good news story that we saved the taxpayers money. To your statement on our accounting procedures, do those need to be looked at so that those old funds aren't sitting out there? Absolutely, and we're committed to that.
Thank you. Following up, given these funds are well on their way to being reprogrammed, does the Corps plan to return any funds to those districts? What's your plan there? And if so, what would that timeline be?
To make sure I understand the question correctly, the districts had no uses for these funds, and so as such, we don't plan to return them. If they come up with and say, we do need some of these, we'll work with them to make sure that those projects can be delivered.
Sure. Well, every district has a disaster of some sort at some point, and I suspect that all those Army Corps districts around the country like to be able to have a little flexibility to tap into funding that was allocated specific to projects within their jurisdiction, which is why I asked that question. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think that exhausts my line of questioning. I yield back.
North Carolina yields back. Mr. Carvajal, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I recently made a visit to the Francis Scott Key Bridge incident with a number of my colleagues to see it firsthand. Admiral Gautier, the Coast Guard has an obligation to respond to all marine casualties, but incidents of this size have an outsized impact on Coast Guard resources. This incident, unfortunately, comes at a time of strained resources and a 10% workforce shortage. What is the operational strain on the Coast Guard's responding to the bridge collapse, and how can Congress help? And what is the impact on the workforce?
Congressman, we've mobilized people from across the country. We've activated reservists to staff the command post and to respond here. We've used cutters and small boats from around the area, helicopters and so on, to do this response. So there's an immediate area impact to readiness, certainly, but what we know is that for unplanned incidents like this, where we mobilize a lot very quickly, there are also readiness impacts that happen well beyond the initial site. And so I think in terms of, and going into what's likely to be a pretty severe hurricane season, I think the main thing here is that in order for the Coast Guard to reconstitute and be ready for the next one, we need to have continued and enduring financial appropriation support from Congress. We spent about $20 million so far in direct and indirect costs here, but we know that our readiness in the waterways management field is brittle. We're short aids to navigation. There's a cutter that's on scene as a patrol commander that is 62 years old, the Coast Guard cutter Sledge. We are working to recapitalize that class of cutter and the Waterways Commerce Cutter, and this is repeated again and again in terms of aircraft recapitalization, major cutter recapitalization support for our people.
Thank you. Admiral Gautier, the IMO ensures minimum global standards for safe shipping practices. The U.S. flagged vessels are subject to higher standards and scrutiny. This is one of the several reasons I believe it is unacceptable that we rely on flag of convenience vessels to carry over 98% of our international cargo. There's a small minority of my colleagues who believe that the Jones Act should be repealed. I am not one of them. How would your job of ensuring safety in U.S. waters be made more difficult if U.S. vessels sailing in our coastal waterways and inland rivers were supplanted by foreign ships with foreign mariners?
Congressman, your question is related to safety and the Coast Guard implications of safety. The Jones Act has been with us for 100 years. It's pretty foundational to how maritime commerce flows in the United States. And the Coast Guard's worked very hard to provide an equivalent level of safety from foreign flag vessels, foreign crews at IMO through established standards. But what I really can say here is that the Jones Act is crucial for our maritime security elements in terms of the industrial shipbuilding capability in the United States of America that the Coast Guard and that the Navy and Merit and others rely on in terms of construct our U.S. flag military and public vessels as well. And we do not want in any way, shape, or form to jeopardize that maritime security element of the defense industrial complex through shipbuilding.
Chair Homendy, it is common practice for American mariners working on U.S. flagged ships to work on board a vessel for 2 to 3 months at a time. Mariners sailing on a flag of convenience vessels often remain at sea for longer. In the case of the Dolly, I understand that the engineers have been on board for more than 8 months. Since your preliminary report showed at least one mistake by the engineer, should we be concerned with the prevalence of flag of convenience vessels which operate with lower standards, operating in and around critical U.S. infrastructure?
Well, we are still on scene and evaluating everything about this accident. We will look at any sort of federal regulations or IMO standards to make sure they're adequate, but it's too early to tell.
What about the standards? If they abide by lower standards, that shouldn't be of concern?
I'm not saying it's not a concern. I'm saying we have to evaluate with this particular accident what was in place and whether that was adequate or not.
But beyond this incident, is there a concern?
I will have to get back to you on that for the record.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Boss from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to associate myself with the comments of the concern for the families and the prayers for tragedies such as this, and also to thank the people that responded so well and are doing the work. But, you know, ensuring that our nation's infrastructure is secure and maintained is an important responsibility of our Congress. But it's also important to have uniform guidelines in place to know how infrastructure is going to be paid for. Now, in my district, when local communities reach out for assistance with grants to do road work, they know that local cost share is at 20%. Now, just recently, my district had on Highway 51, US 51, we had to close, and it's going to be closed for quite some time because a sinkhole opened up. And the local community will need to repair the road, and there will be a cost connected with that work. However, I don't expect the community to try to redesignate the road to be considered part of the interstate highway system to take care of that. Mr. Brott, despite being located on Interstate 695, the Key Bridge was not part of the interstate highway system. The incident that caused the collapse of the bridge occurred in March, and yet the bridge designation wasn't applied to be changed until April. Are you aware of of this change cost share requirements for this road? And is it normal, or is it normal for a road change to be designated after an incident?
Thank you for the question, Representative. This is the first time I'm aware of redesignating a road.
Me too. So can you explain, for the sake of the taxpayers and the people around this country that also have issues, how a roadway has it designated changed suddenly after repair work was identified? Because I can tell you the constituents I represent would like to try to figure out how to do that. Because that's why look, I'm just trying to figure it out because we have uniform rules in place. And if we're going to change them, we're the ones you come to. I need answers.
Yeah, so, sorry, Representative, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Yes, and apologies to the community that had the sinkhole. I'm sure that is quite a impactful event for that community. In this case, this portion of I-695 was part of the NHS. It was shielded as part of the interstate since it was built in the 1970s. I think there was so for mapping purposes, it was part of it. There were some standards that were a little bit different that when they applied to have it designated, we had to do the process of waivers, and that got it from the 80-20 share to the 90-10 share. And so I think my assumption before this incident was that that bridge and that section of I-695 was part of the interstate. So this was just at the request of Maryland to have it redesignated as part of it. And we get those requests. There are parts of the interstate system that are shielded, but not necessarily part of it. There was an example in Alabama a few years ago.
Okay, and you do that just through administrative rule. It doesn't require an act of Congress.
Does not. They would need to come in and say, this is why, these are the design exceptions, whether it's the curves or some of the other elements that they might have had in there. And then our engineers would have to say, yes, this is why we would approve those exceptions.
And you've got to understand the concerns of uniformity. And I understand, believe me, I'm not arguing, let's not fix it as fast as possible. I'm not arguing that, hey, whatever the cost is, as we're trying to recruit, as was mentioned by several people questioning, insurance is not going to pay off overnight. There's going to be arguments. There's going to be all of that, and we're going to fight for that. And we need to get it fixed quickly. It's just other communities around the nation have issues that come up, and that not having a set standard on how it is we respond and how we can get a response back to our own communities makes it very difficult when you do something that isn't normal in this situation, and then we just have to have answers. So I appreciate that. With that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for hosting this hearing, and thank you to all of the witnesses. I want to echo the sentiment of other members who are remembering the tragic loss of life of 6 workers, all of them immigrants from Mexico and Central Americans, all of them seeking a better life in this country, meeting a very tragic fate. So as we rebuild the Key Bridge, we must also advocate for stronger workplace protections for all, including immigrant workers. And this brings me to my first question, Administrator Bott. The Coast Guard's testimony states that 8 construction workers were on the bridge at the time of the collision, and that 1 worker was able to run to safety. If there had been more time when the ship's loss of power was reported and when the collision happened, is there a protocol in place for bridge worker evacuation in an event such as this collision? And if so, can you describe it?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question and for your concern for the workers. Obviously, all work zones in America are dangerous places, and we have rules in place for both the state or the city that is, procuring the contract, and for the companies that are out there. I want to defer to others here, but what I learned through our discussions is that there was a police officer who was attempting to reach the work crew on the bridge to evacuate them, but just given the proximity of the ship, was unable to make it to the crew before the bridge struck.
Do you think the protocol is adequate?
Sir, I would need to think about that and consult with some of our experts. Obviously, this was an unprecedented event, so I just want to evaluate that and get back to you for the record.
Chair, how many?
Other bridge structures, they have advanced warning systems, and we'll look at that as part of our investigation. But I will just say, from the time the pilot's dispatcher called MDTA police and the bridge was ordered closed, was 52 seconds. 52 seconds. That was the time of, it's almost impossible to get in that situation, to get a longer time. And if you just look at the time from the blackout to the bridge strike, it was 4 minutes total. But I appreciate your question because it is really tragic what occurred, and we want to prevent that from reoccurring, and that's our whole mission, which is why we'll look at advanced warning systems as well.
And thank you for that. And Administrator Bott, if you could get back to me, it'd be greatly appreciated. To Vice Admiral Gautier, the Dolly had been inspected by the Coast Guard about 6 months prior to the incident with the Key Bridge. It's unusual that a major malfunction like this could occur with no previous indication of faulty systems after being cleared by an inspection of only 6 months prior. And what are the requirements on foreign flagged, foreign-owned vessels to report any malfunctions to the Coast Guard when operating at a U.S. port?
The Coast Guard has a requirement for any vessel that suffers an issue to notify on what we call a reportable marine casualty. And there are a variety of qualifications, sort of circumstances by which you have to notify the Coast Guard of those casualties.
Thank you much. Lastly, very briefly to all of the panelists who'd like to chime in, although the NTSB investigation is ongoing, recommendations are forthcoming, what's needed from Congress, if anything, to improve worker safety?
So I'll speak first. It's critically important for us to have the fulsome results of the investigation, I think, before we move ahead with any sorts of implementations based on those recommendations. I will say, so the Coast Guard is conducting a Marine Board of Investigation in coordination with NTSB and cooperation. If we find something in the near term that we think is important and urgent enough to do an advisory on, we will go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
Sir,
Chair?
this could happen in any of your districts, right? And and I would say where you have navigable waterways, whoever's owning, I keep reiterating this, if you own a bridge, if a state owns a bridge or other entity owns a bridge, look at the current structure, do a risk assessment. You can do that now. You don't have to wait until we issue an urgent recommendation or come to the conclusion of our investigation. Make sure you're ensuring safety for what's going through on that bridge or in the navigable waterways now.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. And my first question is going to be for the Coast Guard and the NTSB. Obviously, everybody just about has offered their condolences to the families of the people who lost their lives, but I'm thinking if I were a family member, I would want more than condolences. I would have questions that I wanted answered. And the first question is why? I think from the information that we've received so far, the explanation would be we had vulnerable infrastructure and we had a ship that lost power. But I think there's a deeper question as to why. And also, what are we going to do about that so that it doesn't we don't get a repeat incident? If the ship had a tug escort, would it have hit the bridge even after it lost power?
We're looking into that as part of our investigation. I can't answer that right now. It's a question that we have, but it is something we're delving into.
The same for the Coast Guard. We don't know whether there was sufficient time to have made a difference or whether it would have added to the casualty or not.
I hope that's something that you're looking into and looking at other places around the country where these large ships are passing by vulnerable infrastructure without tugs. I know Mr. Graves talked about the ship in New Orleans, and from my understanding, all those ships down there now have tug escorts. Mr. Bott, you're here to discuss the need for a massive bridge reconstruction that will require years-long effort and billions of dollars from the American taxpayer. Meanwhile, those very taxpayers have been waiting for over 2 years for FHWA to perform repairs to a washed-out gravel road on White Rock Mountain in Franklin County, Arkansas, in my district. This road provides access to 4 service concessionaire facilities, not to mention critical passage for emergency services in the area.
The project has already been funded, but is apparently so tied up in red tape that my office can't even get a clear answer from your agency on when the washout will be filled. If FHWA is unable to reconstruct a gravel road in less than 2 years and counting, why should we trust your agency with billions in funding for a project of this magnitude?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm happy to go back and take a look and figure out exactly what is going on with that project and report back to your office.
Thank you. And this, I guess, would be for the Corps and for Mr. Bott, but there's an issue that happened in Floyd Bennett Field, which is a National Park Service facility in New York City. And you may ask, what in the world does that have to do with this project? But I'll tell you what it has to do. This administration used alternative arrangements to waive every NEPA and environmental regulation in the Park Service to build a migrant camp, and they did that in less than 2 weeks. They waived all those regulations. I'm wondering if the administration has the intent to use alternative arrangements, not just CEs, but alternative arrangements to repair this bridge, which is obviously very vital infrastructure.
So we are in close coordination with Maryland DOT. We are not going to waive NEPA, but it is our strong likelihood that we'll end up with a categorical exclusion because we're replacing a bridge in relatively the same footprint that existed before.
Does the administration have the legal authority to waive NEPA, to use alternative arrangements to even go beyond the CE?
Sir,
the answer is yes, and they can do that. And it's amazing to me that they would do it on a Park Service facility that 1 million visitors in New York City use to build a migrant camp, yet it doesn't seem to be an option on the table to rebuild this vital piece of infrastructure. And I hope the administration would not only afford this same luxury to critical infrastructure, but also to a lot of smaller projects around the country that get tied up in the process when the administration has full authority to do that. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize Mr. Stanton for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to each of the witnesses for your hard work in responding to this critical emergency in our country. And like every member of this committee, I do send my deepest condolences to the families of the 6 human beings, the workers who lost their lives as a result of this tragic incident. When the dolly crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland, we saw the agencies represented here today jump into action. But the road to rebuild is long and it requires coordination between our local, state, and federal governments. As a former mayor myself, I understand how critical intergovernmental cooperation is for efficiency and speedy results. Administrator Bott, to my understanding, one of the ways the Federal Highway Administration responded to the disaster was by reclassifying the bridge as an interstate. Tell us more about the purpose of that reclassification and how will that help with speedy bridge repair?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We received a request from Maryland DOT shortly after the bridge disaster to reclassify, and so we went through the usual process that we would do for any state DOT that was asking to come in. I think our assumption had been that it was part of the interstate since it was shielded and was on maps that way. So going back, the difference will be that instead of being part of the NHS, it will be officially it is now officially part of the interstate and goes from an 80-20 cost share to a 90-10.
That's great. Another important action taken at the outset of the disaster was the quick release of emergency relief program funds, a reimbursable program. I understand it was $60 million that was released in March. That's a sizable amount. How was that $60 million number decided?
Thank you, Congressman. So we have been in close contact with Maryland DOT from the early hours. Specifically, I think this is a great example of the quick release funding being put to work. They actually had a contractor who could mobilize very quickly, had cranes in the area, and while the Army Corps was focused on the navigable channel. That $60 million is helping to clear wreckage simultaneously from the non-navigable waterways.
And obviously, the cost will be significant above and beyond the initial amount. Tell us the role that the emergency relief program will play in additional funds for bridge repair and any other federal highways programs that will likely need to be utilized in this important work.
Yeah, and so as thank you, Congressman, for some of the questions that have come in, the first 270 days, the emergency, repair work is funded at 100, and then longer-term permanent repair work is funded at 90/10. Traditionally, through this program, the initial estimate is around $1.7 to $1.9 billion for the bridge. It'll be a 4-year construction, and that is that critical piece where Maryland will have the certainty that federal funding will be available so that they can move forward with their procurement.
That's great. Lastly, it's my understanding that one of the primary roles of the Federal Highway Administration currently is to also give technical assistance to the Maryland Department of Transportation. Is there anything you can share with us today regarding those conversations as the federal partners to Maryland DOT?
Thank you. And Congressman, I do want to recognize our federal highway staff that have been on site and in close coordination, both in Maryland and in headquarters. So we are meeting with them on the emergency work, on getting the ER funding, on the procurement, on the elements of the bridge design that are going to be out there. So it is a really strong partnership that exists.
We appreciate the work of yourself, FHA, all the other agencies represented today. It is critical that we get the bridge rebuilt as soon as possible, not only for Baltimore, City of Baltimore, State of Maryland, but the entire economy of the United States of America. So thank you for your work you've already done and the work you will do on this important project. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Mast for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Batt, would this be an accurate way to categorize you? You're in charge of collecting the checks for the future project?
Sorry, Congress, I'm in charge of collecting checks for the future project?
Money. You're in charge of getting the money for the project?
Yes.
Okay. Have you received any money from any insurer yet?
No, sir.
Which insurers have you sought monies from?
So to be clear, the insurance policy that we are talking about is an insurance policy for the Maryland Department of Transportation. And so we're working with Maryland DOT to work through the elements of that insurance policy.
Nothing for any insurance company of Grace Ocean Private LTD?
So the Department of Justice is leading efforts around for the efforts for the United States to recover the funds. So that's not a federal highway function.
Nothing also for you in terms of requesting anything from insurers of Maersk who chartered that vessel from Grace?
No, sir. The Federal Highway Administration role in this is the debris removal in the non-navigable waterway and then working with Maryland DOT to rebuild the bridge. We will take back any insurance funds that come in and reimburse the ER program.
What has Department of Justice told you to this point about, have they requested monies from any of those insurers or any other companies?
Sir, I would not be able to comment on Department of Justice efforts. It's I know they're working on it, I'm not aware.
So they haven't had any contact with you about requesting monies. You can comment about your involvement, your conversation with them, not necessarily what they've done.
Specifically, sir, the only email that I've received is from DOJ to preserve all of my emails for upcoming and likely years-long litigation.
Why is it likely years-long litigation?
Again, sir, I can only speak to my efforts around bridge building and litigation that occurs when there's a claims between a contractor and a state where they don't feel that the product it meets. That can take years. So billions of dollars and international maritime law, I can only assume will be a fairly lengthy process.
None of us are naive enough to say that insurance companies just readily come out and offer us large payouts for things that are insured. We would be naive to say that. It's just not the state of the world. But in the midst of this catastrophe, I guess is a great word to categorize it. Have you seen anything or heard anything from DOJ about these insurance companies offering anything or trying to say that they do not have liability for this?
Sir, I would need to come back to you. I would have to check with our chief counsel, our general counsel at DOT, and other agencies, but I'm happy to come back on that question.
I appreciate that. Have you heard anything about whether they've already executed any type of business interruption insurance for the vessel that's not in use right now?
Sir, I am not aware of that.
Okay. And a lot of these questions, again, I appreciate you listening to. You don't have the answers for them. Madam Chairwoman, I would encourage this committee to get some of the other entities in here, since we're talking significantly across both sides of the aisle about the funding for this bridge, the timing for the repairs of this bridge, things peripheral to that, that we bring in the insurance companies for conversation, the shipping companies for conversation about this as well. And I would hope that we would do that in the next maybe next week that we're in session, but it's certainly sensical that we speak to you all about this, but it's also sensical that we speak to the private entities that are involved in this as well. I thank you for your testimony. I thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Ms. Fushi for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, and thank you to the chairs for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here with us today. The tragic events that took place in the early morning hours of Tuesday, March 26th, were a tragedy not simply for Baltimore or Maryland, but for the nation. I join my colleagues in mourning the 6 lives lost in this catastrophic accident. While I have been heartened by the response of the Baltimore community, who have, at last count, already fundraised over $500,000 to support the families of the Key Bridge victims, it is the responsibility of both the federal government and the private sector to ensure something like this never happens again, which is at least in part why we're here today. The Biden administration, the state of Maryland, the Coast Guard, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, among others, have taken commendable initiative and swift action in responding to this crisis, something that has been highlighted by the witnesses here today. I want to thank all of you for being here. I know your time is valuable, especially in the midst of an ongoing situation like this. So my colleagues and I, we greatly appreciate your time and your testimonies. I think most of us on this committee understand that this matter is going to require expeditious bipartisan support here in Congress. If we wish to mitigate at best, we can get to the economic and the supply chain ripple effects of the FSK bridge collapse. However, I believe it's worth noting that there are also some significant road safety implications here, as well as even further that underscore this need for congressional support. With the port no longer at full capacity, commercial trucks are being forced to take roads through residential areas that aren't equipped for that kind of traffic. Chairwoman Hamady and Administrator Bott, can either of you speak to the traffic safety issues to other vehicles on the roads, to pedestrians, or to the residential road infrastructure that have either already emerged as a result of the FSK bridge closure or are at risk of emerging should access to the port remain limited?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Obviously, there is thank you for noting the traffic impacts. I would just, in the interest of time, I would highlight the hazmat traffic that, the hazmat materials are not allowed in the tunnels through Baltimore. And so that was one of the critical elements of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, was to provide hazmat material to move around. And now what's happening is they're rerouting around the north side of 695. It goes through neighborhoods, and it's suboptimal from a routing perspective. So that's just one example. And then obviously, as you mentioned, there are trucks and other commercial vehicles and just higher levels of traffic working their way through residential areas now as well.
This is an issue that I would typically defer to Federal Highways just because we're just focused on the investigation itself. So thank you.
Thank you. I, like many of my colleagues, have been particularly concerned about the regional implications on unemployment that the bridge collapse and reduction of port operations are having on the surrounding community. As the state of Maryland has estimated that 270,000 jobs will ultimately be impacted. Even so, I've been especially encouraged by the efforts thus far of the Biden administration to support the plethora of temporarily displaced workers who have had their employment either directly or indirectly impacted since the events of March 26th. For instance, the administration funneled an initial tranche of $3.5 million to the region via its Dislocated Workers Grant Program back in April to support temporary cleanup and recovery employment opportunities for those who've lost their jobs due to the FSK Bridge incident, with more support funds on the way. Vice Admiral Gautier and Major General Graham, can you speak to the efforts of the U.S. Coast Guard and the Army Corps, respectively, about the ongoing efforts to restore services and access to the port, given the widespread ramifications such efforts will have on employment in the region?
Well, let me go first because I want to do a shout out to the Army Corps of Engineers. Commerce is flowing. The depth of the channel has been restored to 48 of 50 feet. It's narrower than what it typically is, but is sufficient for Coast Guard to put one-way vessel and tug escort controls to get traffic in and out. And so we've seen over 35 deep draft vessels that have transited, over 300 smaller barges and other things that have been able to transit in and out. And so I think what we're seeing is that the system is restoring itself to normal functions while we work together in unified command to make sure the full channel width and depth is restored.
And ma'am, working with the port in the state of Maryland, open up as many alternative channels as we could. Small craft, and we successfully got to larger and larger craft. As Vice Admiral Gautier said, we were able to get a 35, now about 40, 48-foot channel to get those key car carriers moving, and we remain committed to getting the full channel open by the end of this month.
Madam Chair, that's my time. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and I recognize Mr. Yackham for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I, too, want to offer my condolences to the families who lost loved ones in this disaster. I want to thank our witnesses not just for being here, but also for the tireless work that you and your agencies have done in putting into the recovery efforts, but also the investigative matters that you've undertaken as we look into this disaster even deeper. So thank you. Before I get to my questions about the topic at hand, Administrator Batt, I feel the need to follow up on a conversation we had in December when you were before this committee. You may recall that we discussed the NEVI and the CFI programs, which have a combined $7.5 billion at their disposal to build electric vehicle charging stations. As of the December hearing, NEVI had bought just one charging station online in 2 years. I asked you how many charging stations you expected those programs would bring online in 2024, and you promised to follow up with a, quote, very specific number. But in March, you sent a response that contained no specific number. You noted that hundreds of millions of dollars had gone out the door to build 7,500 ports. But there was no indication as to how many, if any, of those would be brought online this year. And thus far in 2024, NEVI has been responsible for 6 charging stations, again, with roughly $7.5 billion at its disposal. And there doesn't appear to be any public information for the completed CFI chargers. Administrator Batt, I want to give you one more chance here. How many more NEVI and CFI funded charging stations do you expect to be bought online for this year?
Thank you, Representative, and thank you for the follow-up. So we are working closely with our state DOT partners and cities across the nation. We're also working closely with the joint office that has been set up between Department of Energy and Department of Transportation. Since that time, there have been several states that have brought online NEVI chargers. As been in Vermont, Ohio, Kentucky, Utah is going to have their first. So there are dozens, and I will get you the specific number, but dozens that we are anticipating coming online just in the next couple of months. 35 of those states have their solicitations out. And then specifically on CFI, on January 5th, we rolled out $623 million in grants in January for CFI nationwide. And those we're working with grant agreements now to get those built this year.
So again, how many do you think will be brought online this year total? Just to give just a ballpark number.
Probably in the hundreds to in the thousands range this year. And again, I want to differentiate between DFC chargers and the level 2 chargers that are obviously replacing ones that are existing on the network.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I do want to make sure that as we go throughout the balance of the year, we stay in touch on this particular topic. We've allocated $7.5 billion, and we're as of just a month ago, we were at 8 total chargers, and we want to make sure that the money that has been appropriated by this Congress is spent wisely. Turning our attention to the Key Bridge, Administrator Batt, I want to build on what Mr. Boss talked about with his redesignation of the bridge as an interstate system. I share his sentiments that we should get this bridge rebuilt quickly, but I believe we should also be mindful of new precedents that we set and establish as we go through this whole process. You mentioned that part of an Alabama highway was redesignated as a part of the interstate system. How long did that process take from application to approval?
This was back in, sir, I'd have to go back to you on the exact dates, but probably a few weeks. And actually, to be clear, I think that was changing the main line of the interstate with the bypass. So maybe not exactly apples and apples.
Maryland's request to redesignate this as an interstate was made after the collapse. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does your agency have the authority to retroactively designate damaged or destroyed infrastructure as a part of the interstate system?
Sir, I would have to clarify on our exact authority and the retroactive piece. I just know that we received the request after the incident, and we went through our typical process and designated as part of the interstate.
Is there any precedent for retroactively designating damaged or destroyed infrastructure as a part of the interstate system?
Sir, I'd have to come back to you on that. I'm not aware.
Yeah, I would very much like to know if your agency was within its authority to retroactively designate this as an interstate as opposed to its former designation as a part of the state highway systems. Thank you. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you.
For 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Just a horrible event. Ms. Hamady, or all of you, but I want to direct this question to you. In 2007, near the district I represent in the Bay Area, there was a similar incident with the San Francisco Bay Bridge. It's the second busiest toll bridge after the George Washington Bridge in the United States, but it is the terminus of Interstate 80. So what happened there was the fender system, and California had gone further, kept the bridge from being damaged, but it still had to be shut down so that you and Caltrans could go through and make sure it was safe, plus it's seismically vulnerable. So what do we do in cases like that in 2007 where lessons learned are looked at and sort of consistent with some of the other questions, irrespective of whether it's part of the federal highway system, and just making sure that state departments of transportation, that they know what the best practices are for their area?
Well, for our role as part of an investigation agency, we continue to share lessons learned as part of any investigation, including with state departments of transportation. Certainly, we've conducted a number of investigations involving vessel strikes on bridges and have shared those lessons learned and continue to do so, and to continue to advocate even for recommendations that have been closed unacceptable. But I will say that the Federal Highway Administration also has close contact with their state partners to continue to highlight safety issues and risk assessment as well.
Vice Admiral, this happened very close to your admiral's, his home was beautiful on Treasure Island, but in that instance, also, they were required to have bar pilots come in. So it's Oakland is the fourth busiest port in the United States. A lot of traffic goes through there, but again, we've got lots of bridges, and the Bay Bridge closest to it. So a lot of the operations of that port, they work closely with the Coast Guard to make sure that the management of the transportation system works, and it works properly in terms of the whole transportation system. So in this case, a heavily traveled bridge. How does your department and the Coast Guard coordinate, again, on your experience around the world, on how to make sure that these structures that are run by state transportation agencies, particularly if they're not part of the interstate, has the best information about the dangers to marine traffic, commercial marine traffic?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I'm familiar with the Costco Busan incident that you're referring to, and done many years of operations there in the Bay Area. We're doing a Marine Board of Investigation. We, just like we did in Costco Busan, we do an investigation of findings of fact, and then we recommend and take remedial actions based on that. But I think what we're talking about here is a little bit different in terms of the system as you've mentioned it. And so the Coast Guard does have a set of tools, risk management tools, that we get together with stakeholders in any given port to evaluate the totality of the risk if something changes, like if a channel becomes deeper or if a new bridge gets built and so on. One comes to mind as a Port and Waterways risk assessment. One was done in Baltimore, but not since 2001. So as a result of this incident, the Coast Guard is initiating a board of inquiry under my signature, which will look at how the Coast Guard does these assessments, how recent they are in the ports around the country, and to examine the top 10 ports for some lessons learned, including bridge fendering systems, hazards to navigation, and so on, together with stakeholders so we can draw some conclusions and then move out with a refined toolkit to other ports around the country.
Coming back to Ms. Hamady, it's part of just the most recent report about human error on the boat. Reminds me of some of our discussions about the aviation industry. There's a lot of pressure on these companies to move product and show a profit. Are you concerned the same thing, that we're not providing enough oversight to the people who are running the ships in the system, and they're being overworked, so they're missing things, whether it's people who are mechanics repairing the ships or people who are operating the ships?
Well, with respect to what occurred in port on March 25th, there